The letters were folded in thirds, the way a man folds paper when he means to be practical about it. Abigail Sterne had read them so many times that the creases had gone soft. The ink on the words "yours" faithfully faded to a ghost of itself. 7 months of correspondence from a man named Franklin Mott of Copper Falls, Wyoming, who had answered her advertisement in the National Register with a letter so plain and sensible that she had trusted it immediately, which was perhaps the first of her mistakes. She was 26 years old, a schoolteacher from Dayton, Ohio, with no family left to speak of. Her mother had gone in March, her father 6 weeks after, as if he had simply decided there was nothing left worth staying for. The house on Elm Street had been sold to pay what debts remained, and Abigail had found herself standing in the center of her own life, with the peculiar lightness of a woman who owned very little and owed nothing to anyone. She had placed the advertisement carefully, weighing each word. Schoolteacher, 26, steady character, seeks correspondence with a man of the West. Matrimony the object. Sentimental men need not reply. She had meant that last part seriously. Franklin Mott had not been sentimental. He had written of his property outside Copper Falls, 1,200 acres, good grass, a creek that ran year-round. He wrote of needing a wife who could read a contract and manage a household without being told twice. In his 4th letter, when she had asked timidly about the house, he had written back one line that had undone her completely. There is a proper room off the south end of the house I intend to make into a schoolroom, should you want to teach the rancher's children. A schoolroom. For her, it was such an intimate understanding of what she needed that she had pressed the letter flat against her chest and sat very still for a long moment. That was 7 months ago. Now the train was pulling into Wyoming with a sound like something heavy being dragged across stone, and Abigail watched the landscape through the window, wide, brown, indifferent, and wondered if she had been a fool. The station at Copper Falls was smaller than she had imagined. A wooden platform, a water tower, a bench the color of old bone. The conductor called the stop, and she gathered her things with steady hands, telling herself the fluttering in her ribs was excitement and not dread. She stepped onto the platform into air that tasted of dust and cold pine. The train groaned and pulled away. She waited for the noise of it to fade. The platform was empty. There was a station master, a narrow-shouldered man, with spectacles and ink on his cuff, who locked the station house door at 6 o'clock without looking at her. She did not ask him to stay. She sat on the bench and folded her hands in her lap and told herself what she had told herself at her mother's grave and again at her father's, that the next thing to do was the only thing to do, and she would do it when the time came. An hour passed. The sky went from orange to violet to a deep, still black. The temperature dropped in the way that Wyoming temperatures drop, not gradually but all at once, as if someone had opened a door to a cold room. He was not coming. She understood this with a calm that surprised her. The calm of a woman who had learned not to be surprised by loss. She was still sitting there, her small trunk beside her, and her hands gone stiff with cold, when she heard the slow, deliberate sound of a horse's hooves on the packed dirt road beside the platform. A man rode out of the dark, tall in the saddle, leading a second horse loaded with grain sacks. He pulled up short when he saw her. He did not ride on. He sat his horse for a long moment, and in the dim light spilling from a distant street lamp, she could see the shape of him, broad through the shoulders, hat pulled low, the kind of stillness that comes not from ease but from discipline. He swung down. He walked toward her with the unhurried step of a man who had learned a long time ago that the world did not move faster for being rushed. "Ma'am," he said, His voice was low and rough, the kind of voice that belonged to open spaces. "Last train's been and gone." "I'm aware of that," she said. Her own voice came out steadier than she felt. He looked at her trunk. He looked at her face. He did not ask who she had been waiting for, or why they had not come. He seemed to understand, with the same quiet economy he applied to everything else, that asking was unnecessary. "There's a boarding house in town," he said. "Clean place. Good woman runs it." She stood. "My name is Abigail Sterne." He touched the brim of his hat. "Declan Rourke." He loaded her trunk onto the pack horse without asking permission or waiting for thanks. He did not offer her his arm. He simply started walking, leading both horses, and she fell into step beside him. They walked the half-mile into Copper Falls in a silence that was not uncomfortable. It was simply the silence of two people who did not yet know each other well enough for small talk, and who were both sensible enough to recognize it. The boarding house was run by Mrs. Ingram, a compact woman of 60 with iron-gray hair and eyes that saw everything and forgave most of it. She took one look at Abigail's face and said, "Come in, dear. Supper's cold, but I can warm it." She said it, the way a woman says the practical thing when the emotional thing would only make matters worse. Declan Rourke set the trunk on the porch. Before Abigail could ask about payment, he said quietly, without looking at her, "Put her first week on my account, Mrs. Ingram." And then he was gone, back into the dark, his horse's hooves fading down the road, until there was nothing left but the sound of the wind in the eaves. The room was small and clean. It had a narrow bed, a washstand, a hook on the door for her coat. Abigail sat on the edge of the mattress and allowed herself, very quietly, to come apart. Not with great heaving sobs. She did not have those in her. But the tears came, hot and private, for the schoolroom she would never see, and for the particular humiliation of having been so thoroughly, so willingly deceived. She gave herself 10 minutes. Then she washed her face and went to sleep. In the days that followed, she made herself useful to Mrs. Ingram, keeping the accounts, answering correspondence, mending linens in the evenings. She was good at all of it, and the work kept her hands busy and her mind from dwelling too long in the dark. Mrs. Ingram, for her part, asked no questions and offered no pity, which suited Abigail precisely. She saw Declan Rourke twice that week. Once, from the window, when he rode in for supplies and tied his horse without glancing toward the boarding house. And once on the third day, when he came in for a receipt Mrs. Ingram had been holding. He nodded to Abigail over the older woman's shoulder. She nodded back. That was all. On the 8th day, there was a knock at her door. It was Mrs. Ingram. "Mr. Rourke is downstairs," she said, with an expression Abigail could not read. "He'd like a word." He was standing by the front window when she came down, hat in both hands, turning it slowly by the brim. The parlor seemed smaller with him in it, not because he was loud or restless. He was neither, but because his presence had a kind of gravity to it, like a stone set in the center of a room. "Miss Sterne," he said. He was quiet for a moment, as if arranging his words with the same care he gave to everything else. "My daughter is 7 years old. She has no schooling to speak of. There's no schoolteacher in Copper Falls, and He stopped. "I am not suited to the work." It was not quite an admission, and not quite a confession. It landed somewhere between the two. "The ranch is 4 miles out," he continued. "There is a room off the kitchen, small. It has a desk and a window. I will pay your wages and board here with Mrs. Ingram." Abigail looked at him for a long moment. He met her eyes without flinching, which she appreciated. "What is your daughter's name?" she asked. "Lucy," he said. "All right, Mr. Rourke," she said. "I'll come." The ranch sat in a fold of land between two low hills, sheltered from the worst of the wind. The house was log-built, plain and solid, with a wide porch that faced west toward the mountains. Everything about it was functional, and nothing about it was soft. The room he showed her, off the kitchen, just as he'd said, held a desk, a straight-backed chair, and a window that looked out onto a fenced kitchen garden. The beds turned over for winter. It was sparse, but it was enough. Lucy Rourke had her father's coloring, dark hair, dark eyes, and none of his quiet. She was a small, fierce creature who looked at Abigail with unabashed suspicion and then said, "Papa says you're going to teach me to read properly." "That's right," Abigail said. "He can't read very well either," Lucy said. From behind her, Declan said, without any expression at all, "Thank you, Lucy." Abigail pressed her lips together to keep from smiling. She walked to the ranch each morning as the sun came up, and walked back to town each evening as it went down. The work was the most straightforward thing in her life. Lucy was quick and curious, and the lessons moved at a pace that made Abigail remember why she had become a teacher to begin with. She would sometimes lose an hour without noticing. So absorbed was she in the small drama of a child making sense of the world one word at a time. On the second morning, she arrived to find a cup of coffee sitting on the corner of her desk. It was hot, and beside it, pressed flat so the petals would not bruise, was a single stem of dried yarrow, the kind that grew in the cracks of the fence posts, yellow and ordinary and stubborn. There was no note. Declan was already out on the range. She drank the coffee. She set the yarrow in her inkwell. The next morning, it was there again. Not yarrow this time, but a sprig of juniper, nothing special. The kind of thing a man picks up without thinking while mending a fence, or while thinking of something else entirely. It became the first thing she looked for when she came through the kitchen door each morning. She learned him the way you learn a man who does not offer himself easily, in pieces and at a distance. She learned that he rose before first light and did not come in until the work was finished, not until it was done to his satisfaction, and not a moment before. She learned that when Lucy had a bad night and came to his room frightened, he would sit with her until she slept again, then be back at the fence-line by dawn, as if he had not lost a minute of rest. She learned that he carved things, small animals from scraps of pine, left on Lucy's pillow or the kitchen windowsill, a rabbit, a sparrow, a small running horse. One afternoon she found one on her desk, a schoolhouse. Tiny, no bigger than her thumb, with a little door and two small windows. She did not say anything to him. She set it beside the inkwell, next to the dried yarrow. He noticed. She saw him notice. He looked away first. In early November, 6 weeks into her time at the ranch, she was in town buying thread when Mrs. Ingram came to the counter with a bundle of the afternoon mail. The older woman sorted through it with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had read other people's correspondence for decades, without reading it. If one understood the distinction. Mrs. Ingram said, and then stopped. Abigail looked up. "Letter for Mrs. Franklin Mott," Mrs. Ingram said slowly, holding a cream-colored envelope to the light. "Return address, Denver. She's over at the Mott property, out on the South Road." She glanced at the front of the envelope again, then set it down with the particular careful deliberateness of a woman who had just understood something she wished she hadn't. Funny thing. Only ever heard that name once before, the day you came in. The thread slipped from Abigail's fingers and fell to the floor. Mrs. Ingram looked at her, at the color leaving her face, at the way she had gone very still, the way a woman goes still when she is deciding not to fall. "Oh, child," Mrs. Ingram said softly. "Oh, you poor girl." In the street outside, Copper Falls went on about its business. A wagon passing, a dog barking 2 streets over, someone hammering something that needed to be hammered. And Abigail stood in the middle of the general store and understood, with a cold and perfect clarity, that Franklin Mott had not changed his mind and failed to appear. He had never intended to appear. He had written those letters from a life he already had, from the very town she had traveled to find him in, and he had done it for reasons she could not fathom and did not care to. She walked back to the ranch without being sure she had decided to. Declan was at the corral gate, replacing a hinge that had come loose. He had his back to the road, and his sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the cold, and he turned when he heard her step. He took one look at her face and set down his tools. She told him. She kept her voice level, which cost her more than she showed. She told him about the advertisement, about the letters, about the promise of the schoolroom. She told him what Mrs. Ingram had said and what it meant. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. The muscle in his jaw moved. He looked at the mountains the way she had seen him look at them before, except that his eyes were colder now, with an anger that was not directed at the mountains, but at a man who was not here to receive it. "I can ride to the county sheriff," he said. "Mail fraud. A man can be held for that." She had already thought about it. In the 4 miles between the general store and this gate, she had thought about the letters being read aloud by officials, about her name becoming a story people told, about being the woman who had traveled across 2 states, for a man who already had a wife in the same town she'd arrived in. "And what would I get back?" she said. "My pride isn't something a court can restore. He used it up, and it's gone. I'd rather spend what I have left on something worth spending it on." She looked at him steadily. "I want to let it go, Mr. Rourke. I want to look at what's in front of me, and not at what's behind." He held her gaze for a long moment. She did not look away. Later she would think that something shifted in his face in that moment, though she could not have named exactly what. He had always looked at her with a kind of measured attention. This was different. This was the look of a man who had been searching the horizon for something he expected to be far away, and had suddenly found it very close. He picked up his tools and turned back to the gate. "Lucy's inside," he said. "She's waiting on the last chapter." Abigail went inside. The winter settled in properly after that. The days grew short and the work filled them. Lucy's lessons in the morning, the 1,000 small tasks of keeping a household through a Wyoming winter in the afternoon. Abigail cooked supper more often than not, because she was there and it needed doing. They ate together in a silence that had long since stopped being awkward and become something else, something she did not name. One evening in December, she asked him if he would like her to read to him. She said it the same way she might have asked if he wanted the lamp moved, as if it were a neutral and practical thing. He said yes, without looking up from the harness he was mending. She read to him every evening after that, while he worked with his hands and Lucy slept. She read him stories of the West as it had been and as people hoped it would be. Sometimes he would stop her to ask what a word meant, with the directness of a man who had no patience for pretending he already knew. She answered without flourish. He thanked her without embarrassment. It was the most intimate thing she had ever been part of, she thought, without quite understanding why. In January, on a night when the wind was throwing itself at the windows, with a kind of personal grievance, they were sitting by the stove after supper when he put down the bridle he had been oiling and said her name. She looked up. He set his hands flat on his knees. "This house has been quiet for a long time, 4 years, since Lucy's mother." He paused, and she let him take the time he needed. "I got used to it, or I thought I did. But you've been here 2 months, and I noticed the difference. He said it simply, with no decoration. I'd like it to stay different. The fire settled in the stove. Outside, the wind found no way in. I don't have fine words, he said. I'm not a letter-writing man, as you may have gathered, but I know what I've got here, in this house, these past months, and I know I don't want to watch you walk back to town in the spring and not come back. He looked at her directly, the way he did everything, without flinching, without apology. I am asking you to stay, Abigail, as my wife, if you'll have me. She thought of the letters that had brought her here. The schoolroom promised by a man who had never meant to deliver it. She thought of how she had sat on that platform in the dark and believed the world had closed a door on her. She looked at Declan Rourke, at the lines around his eyes, the rough-knuckled hands, the small carved schoolhouse still sitting on her desk in the room off the kitchen. He had not promised her a schoolroom. He had simply given her one, without calling attention to it, because it was what she needed, and he had seen that plainly enough. Yes, she said, I'll stay. The smile that crossed his face was brief and a little startled, as if he had readied himself thoroughly for a different answer. It reached his eyes before it reached his mouth, and when it did, it changed him entirely, made him look, just for a moment, like a younger man, a man who still expected good things to happen. They were married in March, when the mud had turned back to solid ground. Mrs. Ingram stood up for Abigail, wearing her best hat and pressing a handkerchief to the corner of her eye at intervals. She seemed to believe went unnoticed. Lucy stood beside her father at the front of the church and held his hand with the fierce proprietary grip of a child who has decided a thing belongs to her and intends to keep it. The whole of Copper Falls seemed to find some reason to pass by the church that afternoon. Nobody had arranged this. Nobody needed to. 5 years on, the light came gold and level through the kitchen window. Each morning, the one that faced east. Abigail stood at it every day, her coffee in hand, watching the sky change from gray to rose to the hard, clear blue of a Wyoming morning. Lucy, 12 now, and nearly as tall as she was, moved through the house with the ease of a girl who had never known it to be any other way. The baby, their son, Henry, who had learned his first word pointing at the cat, slept past sunrise, most days, which Abigail had decided was a disposition rather than a character flaw, and Declan had not argued. Out past the corral, the new schoolroom stood. Declan had built it the summer before, planked and proper, with 4 windows and a cast-iron stove and rows of benches for the children who came in from the surrounding ranches each morning. It was not large, but it was sound. He had not said much while he built it. He had simply built it, the way he did everything, because it needed doing, and because she needed it. On the morning it was finished, she had walked out and stood in the doorway, looking at the benches, the clean smell of fresh-cut wood, the light coming through windows she had not expected to be so generous. He had come to stand beside her. "You know," she said, "a man I once almost married promised me a schoolroom." "Did he build it?" Declan asked. "No," she said. He looked at the room. He looked at her. "Well," he said, "took me a while." She laughed. A real laugh, the kind that surprised her. And he smiled his rare, transforming smile and put his arm around her shoulders. And they stood there in the doorway of the room that a lie had somehow pointed her toward, until Henry began to cry from inside the house. And Lucy called out that she would get, and the ordinary morning came back in around them, warm and full, and completely, stubbornly real. The lie had been a compass. It had given her a direction when she had none, and the direction had been wrong in every particular, except the one that mattered, which was that it had brought her here, to this house, to this man, to this life that felt, in a way that no letter had ever quite managed to promise, like home.